So before I read the scenario, there we go. I'm going to highlight a few points from the scenario, and so I thought it would be useful to capture those. So here we go. It's like a bedtime story. It's a great day in Westlake, Michigan. Samantha Jones, a homegrown entrepreneurial superstar, has just announced the opening of the first new branch of her successful tech company, right in downtown Westlake. Everybody in town is buzzing with the news. The announcement board on the Central High School front lawn virtually shouts in all capital letters, "Thank you, Sam." The Downtown Apostles Church announcement board similarly proclaims, "Bless you, Sam." And Harry's Barbershop is crowded with Westlake residents, all speculating about the resurrection of the city, thanks to the good-heartedness of one of their own. In Westlake, Samantha Anna Marie James, founder and CEO of Silicon Valley tech company Storit, is just plain Sam. And in Westlake, like nowhere else, Sam still feels truly at home. The Storit company is tiny compared to the behemoths of Yahoo, Microsoft, Google, and the like. But compared to all the technology companies that have started up and succeeded in the last 25 years, Storit is a small to medium-sized company with a sterling reputation. Storit's technology niche is the development of a small piece of programmed electronic hardware that can be inserted into any electronic device, and with that, pressing two buttons, *Z, enables instant cloud storage of text, photos, music, and most other items on the user's account. So wouldn't you love to have Storit? This invention both saves space on the device, enabling it to run more efficiently and for longer periods of time, and keeps the user's collection of digital information safe for easy future access. City of Westlake is still suffering from the 2008 meltdown of the U.S. economy and the economic collapse of the nearby city of Detroit. Once the engine of the state's proud manufacturing economy, it's fallen on hard times. Good employment opportunities for all of Westlake's residents remain elusive despite concerted efforts by both city government and a consortium of private and public service employers. About 1/5 of Westlake's residents have moved away, primarily to find work. So I'm hoping that at this point you're paying attention to a couple of things. One, that this is a fairly typical story of the middle U.S. Two, that it is a story about a community that has a high-tech connection, has a STEM connection. Unemployment remains about 8%. Underemployment is significantly higher. So the prospect of a new business in town, especially a fancy high-tech business, has city leaders and many residents giddy with anticipation. During a recent personal visit, Sam announced that the Westlake branch of Storit will be open for business in 8 months. So fairly rapid development in Westlake. And further, training programs, this is where you come in. Training programs for Storit jobs will begin in Westlake as well as virtually in 3 months' time. At the outset, STORE at Westlake will employ 3 groups of workers. Number 1, the sign-up team, who have the job of actively recruiting new customers. Number 2, the customer service team, who will provide an ear and expertise to current customers with questions or complaints. And number 3, the idea team, who have the job of percolating ideas with abandon, ideas for improving and expanding or redirecting the company's vision and creative responses to emerging and dynamic markets. Read into this that the Westlake unit is going to be an instrumental part of the entire company, not just a little offshoot. So Sam isn't just providing a handout to the community. She's actually creating an integrated enterprise where things in Westlake will be instrumental to what happens in Silicon Valley. So no manufacturing jobs. Again, we're talking context. No manufacturing jobs means that because this is a former manufacturing center, there aren't going to be jobs that easily translate the existing skill set of local workers. And this is because the plant in California can readily handle an expansion of the business. Rather, the jobs that are coming are jobs requiring experience and or training, and that training is being promised to all who wish to attend. Sam is from the community, sees this as giving back to the community, promises to train all who attend to qualify for these high-paying, prestigious, high-tech jobs. Further, Sam has already established a local advisory group. We all know those are needed, and training for the steward jobs that are coming to Westlake. This group includes K-12 and higher education experts, that's you, in both the content and pedagogy of new technologies, representatives of the city government, business sector, and citizens nominated by others. STORE training is expected to take multiple forms and be offered through multiple venues. And now, here's a snapshot of the city of Westlake. And often, evaluators will use this information as the context for their evaluation and even put it in the report. What I argue is you've already gotten so much context in the early lead up to this that if you miss the importance of that part, this part isn't going to help you much. So the city of Westlake is located on the outskirts of a suburb of Detroit, northwest of the aging city of Detroit. Once fully encircled by manufacturing mecca that was Detroit, Westlake has suffered mightily from Detroit's recent economic distress and has not yet benefited from the modest economic recovery recently emerging in downstate Michigan. The demographic portrait of Westlake is like other mid-sized cities in the northeastern and north central part of the U.S., known as the Rust Belt. It comes from the fact that the city is small, 350,000 people. The demographic portrait is 50% minority, 35% African American, 10% Latino, Latina, and 5% Native American and other. 40% white and 10% recent immigrants from Somalia and Southeast Asia. Economically, a disproportionate number of Westlake residents are considered poor, and incomes below the poverty line are in the majority. Two issues of currency in urban areas around the United States are also present in Westlake. One, gun violence continues to plague certain neighborhoods. Two, the city's schools were desegregated successfully 25 years earlier, but the proliferation of relatively new semi-private charter schools has eroded the level of integration, resegregating the schools. So the superintendent of schools is a believer in evaluation and would like to have this training, the whole setup, be the object of an evaluation. And you're invited as evaluators to consult on what this evaluation project might mean, should mean, could mean in terms of the rollout of this project. So that's to give you a sense of a context in which evaluation frequently goes on. It's not an unfamiliar, bizarre kind of setup. The scenario is courtesy of my good friend and colleague Jennifer Green at the University of Illinois. And the scenario was actually created for a series that the American Evaluation Association is currently sponsoring. It's called the AEA Dialogues on Race and Class in America. And our objective is right out in front, which is if you take a scenario like the one I just read that does not mention overtly racial or class issues, but you start doing evaluation work, it is very likely that you will encounter issues of race and class in designing and conducting the work. Our point is that many evaluators, in fact perhaps most, do not see the social strife presently plaguing the U.S. as part of their portfolio. We want to go in and do evaluations of this training program looking at whether people get trained. We want to think that evaluation is about giving Sam suggestions on what format or what venue or what technology she might use in the training, and not get as involved in the issues that are just circling around like little sharks around this altruistic initiative of Sam's. So that's what I want to spend some time on today, that evaluation is, whether we like it or not, part of the political landscape of the United States. And that we as evaluators, like it or not, are major players in that social, psychological, and political landscape. So as my touch point, I say, evaluators have been known for, because we did this on purpose, have been known for their methods. I do not talk about methods. I think evaluators should aspire to be known more for their conceptualization. Evaluators should aspire to be known as facilitators of conceptualizing a process through which people generate the knowledge that they need to make appropriate decisions. Recentering what evaluation is about. Because if you're involved in conceptualization, you can't ignore the context in which your work is going to be done. Because it is part of your job to ask the right questions that make a difference in that context. I use I guess because I like complicated things, I use a little more complicated evaluation cycle than many authors do, and I won't get involved in all of the little boxes, but I break out some of the clustered steps that many evaluators use to emphasize how you go back and forth iteratively in conceptualizing an evaluation. So you don't just go in and have a presentation where you're told what the purpose and role of the evaluation is, and then you go off and design a study. You have to continually come back and revisit the conceptualization of the study in order to make sure that it's continually tweaked and modified to address the issues that are important. And so, a little propaganda. We live our lives narratively, not in data points. It would be so convenient if we lived our lives as data points. We'd know exactly what to do with that. But if you think about how you experience your daily life, how you're experiencing this conversation, this talk right now, it's not data points, it's narrative, it's a story. And as we've gotten away from storytelling as the official way in which knowledge is conveyed from one generation to the next, we've lost sight of the fact that that is in fact rich learning, rich knowledge that we then can apply to multiple settings, multiple places, multiple things. So I want us want to remind us that we live narratively, and if evaluation at some point doesn't touch on a person's narrative, it hasn't touched the person. Barry McDonald, who's now deceased, great British thinker in evaluation, used to say, people should be treated as owning the facts of their lives. It's a great democratic principle that the researcher, the evaluator, doesn't own the facts of a person's life because they've collected data about that person's life. And if you treat the facts of a person's life, their lived experience, as theirs, it tells you that when you do evaluation, you're not constructing the results. If you're working appropriately, you're co-constructing a narrative with those that it actually belongs to. So, thinking both narratively and respectfully about the details of a person's life is an important part of what we do, or should do. It's also important to note that the evaluation data we collect is all process observations. It's not the actual lived experience. We begin to get confused about our numbers, our observations, our test scores, as if they are real elements of a person's lived experience. I don't know anyone who walks around in their daily life with the SAT scores and the SAT questions alive and active in their imagination. And yet we take those SAT scores and we substitute them for the student. Oh, you're a X and you're a Y. And in terms of our decision making, as academics, they become that number. They become reduced to that number. So it's not a surprise then that our predictive validity is off. We make predictions about who's going to be a good student, predictions about who's going to excel in their later career, and we are way off many times because we have made that predictive validity decision or guess based upon something that is much smaller than what's actually operating. I heard yesterday someone talking about the pipeline metaphor and how challenging it is to think about the STEM pipeline because we don't load our students into a pipeline and ship them through a STEM network, and they are not unthinking, unresponding Autobots inside this pipeline. They, in fact, are very complicated people who are very adept at voting with their feet and making decisions that we would never imagine that they would make. So it's important that for predictive validity, we understand, in fact, whose behavior we're trying to predict. Granularity is a term that I think I have not found a better one, but I think it is an essential element of an evaluator's toolkit to understand this notion of granularity. It's sort of like sugar, that you can have raw sugar which is much coarser, or it can be refined and sifted to the point where it's very, very fine. The level of granularity is sort of like the level of detail that you need in order to do your analysis. And it's sort of also like we used to talk about unit of analysis. Well, granularity is something that you need to match. If you want to make a decision about individuals, the granularity of the data used has to match the kind of decision you want to make. So coarse granularity works for big movement across the country. It does not work for making judgments or predictive decisions about individuals. So sifting your data down to the appropriate level for the kind of judgments that you want to make is a vital, and it seems intuitively clear, part of what an evaluator might do. So context then provides a way for us to think well about a myriad of factors and influences that bring meaning to what we're observing. And if you don't take anything else away from this morning's conversation, I hope that what you take away is that there is no context-free reality. That the meaning of everything that we care about derives from the context in which it is located. And the exact same observation in two contexts means very different things. Context itself is not real. It's our perception of what's there. So Westlake is a made-up city, but we have an image of Westlake now based upon what the scenario has said. And so we have certain perceptions of what Westlake is like based upon our own experiences and other places we've been that are like Westlake. When I read it, it may have felt like home. I know one of the biggest exports of Illinois is people. Every place I go, I run into people from Illinois. We all got out of there as early as we could. So we grew up in places like Westlake, and we still remember that. So we want to, in evaluation, understand the facts of people's lives, understand and respect it. We want to honor it. We want to co-construct our meaning and reality from it. We want to understand that it's grounded in context. And we want to understand that it is not simple, that it is complex. And in a minute, I'm going to give a sort of graphic that I've been working on for about 5 years, and I haven't gotten it right yet. So I keep trotting it out, hoping that I'll eventually get something that I think captures the idea. So I'll show that to you in just a moment. But first, a few conundrums. We're here gathered to talk about projects that are either part of Includes or related to Includes, the broadening participation. And I marvel at the fact that as I go around the country talking about broadening participation, how rarely I hear the idea that for over 120 years, a significant percentage of the students that we are worried about how to broaden their participation in STEM have been successfully engaged in STEM through historically black colleges and universities. Last fall, I had the opportunity to go to Jackson State on a site visit, and I happened to be there during homecoming. So I witnessed the 127th convocation of Jackson State University. And they've been turning out STEM people who go on to excel all over the country, who get PhDs from Stanford and Harvard and MIT. And yet, when we worry about broadened participation as a national issue, we look to Penn and to Michigan for answers in terms of what we should do in our classrooms or at our institutions. We read Tinto and his student retention model and use that as our theory of change. I argue there's probably something in the special sauce that HBCUs have been using for 127 years. Shouldn't we come to understand what is in that sauce and how we might make our own brand of it? Evaluators who are involved in evaluating programs, who ask institutions these simple questions, just might spark some creativity. Well, you brought me in to evaluate your Includes program, and I'm looking at your theory of change or your logic model. Has that been influenced by what's been going on for 127 years, 200 miles down the highway? Just a thought. We know that contextualized understanding is grounded in reality. I was at Tennessee State last year, and my guide was driving me around the campus in a little golf cart, and the original library at Tennessee State is now the Student Academic Support Building. So he was letting me know that, what they do in that building. And as we were passing the building, there were some students sitting out in their outdoor little amphitheater, and he yelled at the students by name and asked them, weren't they supposed to be in class? And they explained that they were working on a group project and so forth, and so we went on. And I said, now, do you know that in the literature, that's called intrusive advising? And he said, intrusive advising? No, that's just the way we operate. That's the way we roll. Okay, so we've reinvented or discovered intrusive advising, and for 127 years, it's just been part of the mix. Okay? Thinking well about the context of learning. So now we're moving from the big national picture into the kind of innovative experiences that students in your programs are expected to have. What I want to encourage thinking about is that these things occur in a time and place, and that the time and place has to be noted. Again, as part of context, it's not just the Westlake's demographics and their proximity to Detroit and those sorts of things. It's also what's in the air and when you happen to be there. Another quick story, I was doing a project where we were working with teachers and administrators in schools in the state of Arizona. Among our wonderful political solutions to things, we came up with the idea that if schools did not get a certain grade for 3 years in a row, they'd be taken over by the state. Like the state would be able to run them better and bring the grade up. So all these schools were busily trying to write school improvement plans so that they wouldn't have this imposed group coming in from outside. So we were working with teachers and administrators on evaluation so that they could do their own school improvement program. And they could pick a part of the school that they felt needed some attention, and we would work with them to develop an evaluation framework and strategy for doing that. And we had National Science Foundation funding to support this project. Quick anecdote, I was working with a school that was in South Phoenix, had transitioned from being a primarily African-American school to being a primarily Latina school. You know how these demographic shifts go. The neighborhood had turned over, so the kids turned over, but the administration and teachers at the school had not quite kept pace. So it had been low-income white community and still had predominantly white teachers. It had managed to get a black principal and a Hispanic assistant principal. They decided they wanted to work on the school discipline code. And so we set about setting up our meetings for that. On the day of the very first meeting, I drove up to the school at the end of the day, to meet with these teachers. And there was a media truck out in front of the school, and spotlight and a interviewer out there, and a throng of people. I had to come in the side gate just to get in onto the school grounds. The day before, during recess, there was an altercation on the playground. And to speed to the punchline, a young Latina student who had been living in LA, her family moved to Phoenix, in building a wall around herself at this new school, was really talking tough and wearing bracelets that suggested she had gang affiliation. And so she was really protecting herself by creating an image. Well, 3 young African-American girls at this school said, we are not impressed by your big city, this and that. And so there wasn't really much of a fight. It was the young girl, the story goes, attempted to swing at one of the 3 black girls and missed, so she slipped and fell. And one of the young black girls sat on her. Well, the parent of the young Latina thought this was outrageous and went to the media and argued that his daughter had been attacked in a hate crime. It was a racially motivated hate crime. So we're just about to open up the school discipline code, and this incident occurs. Time and place matters in an evaluation. So here's my diagram that I've been working on. It's still a work in progress. But the points that I want to make are, we all have a culture of origin. We all have very distal experiences, memories that will always be with us. We all have things that occur more close to our engagement in whatever thing we're trying to look at. But people who do innovations and initiatives in higher education have a tendency to forget all of this and act as if the students didn't breathe or eat or experience until the day before they arrived at our intervention. Because we treat everybody as if they just popped out the egg the day before. And unless you are able to be open to and understand how this sets the person up for this, which is your intervention, evaluating the impact of this intervention is missing an important contextual element. We also often miss the concurrent reality. So we'll throw out the student might be concerned about what's going on at home. Student might have financial needs and so forth. A study at the University of Illinois following up on students of color who were not in academic difficulty but transferred out of STEM revealed that we should be much more concerned about other factors that impact that decision other than grades, prior preparation, or finances. And in fact, the previous presentation talked about one of those factors. What happens when you get a C on that first calculus exam? If you are a young African-American woman whose parents thought you were really reaching for the stars to be an engineering major, and you call home and say you got a C, the counseling that you will get is very different from the white male who goes back to the fraternity house and says, I got a C on the first calculus exam. And it doesn't have anything to do with prior ability, preparation, finances. It has to do with your support system and the context within which you receive and respond to that information. Context is important. The outcomes of our projects also have usually a much longer gestation period than our funding. And as evaluators, how do we factor that in? We can't all do what some of my colleagues have been doing. I have a good friend, Stafford Hood, who's the director of the Center for Culturally Responsive Evaluation and Assessment, who does a lot of work on the reservations in Arizona. And he has made a lifetime commitment to those communities. Well, he can do that because he has a day job at the University of Illinois and previously at ASU. If you're in an evaluation firm, you can't always make that kind of lifelong commitment. But what he says is, I will come back to this community whenever you invite me from now on, because I'm not going to come and just do an evaluation as a one-off. This is the beginning of a relationship. So somewhere in between that ideal and I was paid to come and do this project, project's over, report is filed, have a good life. Somewhere in between those two extremes, you have to find the place that you are comfortable and can work from. Culture is a special case of my argument about context. Because culture it operates like a lens through which you interpret all your other experiences. So if you live in Westlake and you are part of the 35% of Westlake's population that's African American, the intersection of your cultural reality and the contextual reality of Westlake is important. If you're African American female in Westlake, it's even different than African American male. So it would be nice if life was simpler, like the good old days. But the reality is that life is complicated, it's messy, and our perception of what we're experiencing is what determines how we respond. And it's what determines whether the numbers that you get on your outcome surveys are the ones that you want to see or not. So understanding that culture is a lens means that you have to treat culture as a dynamic, because not only is it part of what creates the person, it's part of how they continue to develop and what they continue to see. I argue that broadening participation programs are wonderful, are sorely needed, desperately needed, but they're basically attempts to prop up a broken system. If we had the kind of educational system and child development system and community systems that we purport to have, we wouldn't need broadening participation programs. So part of the reality of evaluating broadening participation programs might be wondering about the systemic causes of the need for broadening participation programs. You weren't necessarily hired to do that, but how can you evaluate the program without some understanding of what creates the need for the program? And whether the program is simply a little Band-Aid on a big problem, that has no chance of addressing the underlying issues, or in fact is something that is robust enough to be helping us to understand what causes the problem to begin with. So if I could create a little army of mercenaries, it would be evaluators who go out with the objective of not just doing evaluation for the here and now, but to understand how the larger system has created the inequities that our programs are designed to ameliorate. And be vocal about those conditions. Just speculating, I wonder if there were any evaluators in and out of the Ferguson, Missouri Police Department prior to Ferguson, Missouri becoming the poster child for dysfunction in the police department. Were there any evaluators in there evaluating training programs or training materials? It's not hard to imagine that there were evaluators looking at the probation department, looking at all sorts of things in Ferguson. And so if evaluators wear the blinders and the green eye shades and focus just on what the contract calls for, those departments like Chicago and Ferguson, Missouri will continue to be as dysfunctional as they are. No one's ever going to bring you in to address the root problem, because if they knew and were willing to acknowledge that root problem, they'd fix it. They bring us in to look at other things, but perhaps as a part of our public mandate, we should be describing and locating our work in those kinds of issues. And evaluation as a field has to also do that same work. That's the basis for the AEA Dialogues on Race and Class, because not all of my colleagues would agree, but I argue that if you think about institutionalized racism, for those who are willing to accept that there's institutionalized practices that result in racial disparity, if you accept just that much, then you ask yourself, so how do we enforce those institutional practices that ultimately create inequity? And you'd have to say evaluators are at least complicit, because who examines those institutional practices? Who does the policy analysis for the laws and the legal regs that put those institutions in place? Who has the privileged role in society of being known for their ability to do inquiry and systematic research and evaluation, which is still in our society revered as the way to impact public policy? We're not as revered as we used to be. And hopefully we'll regain our lofty perch. But nonetheless, we are part of it. We are part of this institution that has been broken for years, at least in terms of how many of our citizens are impacted by it. And so my pronouncement, if you try to do context-free evaluation, which is to say, I can bring my evaluation machine into any situation in the country and run my data, collect my data, turn out my results, and move on to the next place and repeat the cycle. When you want to do context-free evaluation, it's like doing research, but not as useful. Because in research, you try to come up with answers that are independent of a particular context, but still context-bound. And so you know where your answers are valid and where they're not valid. Context-free evaluation has no place where the results have any kind of grounding, because our grounding comes from the context. So, thank you.
So, thank you, Melvin. That was an excellent presentation. And since I have the mic, I'm going to ask the first question. So, sitting here listening to what you were saying, and it's very relevant, I think, to the conversations we've been having here. But I'm listening to it through the lens of the director of an evaluation institute that is funded through soft money and the limited budget constraints that we have. And I was particularly interested in the point you made about granularity and participant experiences and the context that they bring into the program and how that affects how the program affects them. And to me, that sounds like qualitative research or evaluation and interviews and focus groups and things of that nature. And in my mind, I'm thinking dollar signs, right? My question is, how do you bring those two together where you're working within this very limited evaluation budget and you already have a lot of metrics that are, presumably handed down from the funding agency a lot of times that you have to look at. And then obviously this context is so important, and getting at those thought processes and situations that people are coming from are important. So could you speak a little to the balance of how to squeeze that into the budget, paying for real person hours in a limited evaluation budget?
Sure. I think that there are some principles that we can use to approach, I guess I don't want to block that, to approach the issue. It's basically mixed methods. But it is figuring out how to leverage your budget by including other things that give you an opportunity to either confirm your quantitative results or to better understand them. I think that what is often a better use of in mixed methods is to have the qualitative precede the quantitative, so that you can ask smarter questions because you have a better sense of what the questions ought to be about. And you have a better sense of who to ask those questions of. So I like the idea of taking a small sample that you can do focus groups and interviews with, and using that to help then construct the rest of the study. And I think you can do that in a cost-effective way. The other thing that is, of course, useful to do, and an outfit like yours, I think, is in a good position to do this, across the assignments that you get, to begin to build your own in-house knowledge about certain populations and contexts, so that keeping from each study some of that knowledge, so that you aren't obligated to go out and start fresh with every assignment. That's another way to be more efficient in bringing in these other perspectives.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Good talk. I'm curious, so there's always this tension between having rich qualitative data as well as large-scale, large-end quantitative data. And so in the last talk, we saw, we had 10,000 students. I'm curious how, if you were to be brought in as an advisor on this, how would you recommend one of these larger-scale quantitative studies bring in the lens of setting and context? So specifically talking about that study, since we all have that in our minds.
Right.
Thank you.
Two things. One is a bit of a cop-out, which I acknowledge. I made a decision. I got my doctoral degree in measurement and evaluation. I'm fond of saying before most of you were born. Unfortunately, it's really true. 1979. So I've been involved in evaluation a long time. And I made a conscious decision that what I enjoyed in evaluation was working in settings where the big scale process was not really appropriate or what people wanted. And so I've done community arts management, I've done, and I'm now very much involved in broadening participation. So that's part of the response. But the second part is that the kind of knowledge needed should always, in my mind, drive the process. We now do large-scale studies on things where we may not need another large-scale study. So part of this is influencing the funders so that we're putting evaluation resources into creating the kind of knowledge that really will be useful. Unfortunately, especially for federal, I think even more than foundation agencies, there's a certain kind of credibility that they're looking for that only comes from the big scale study. So it's like psychology, the beginning of psychology when it broke away from the natural sciences, from biology and so forth. We didn't want to be known as a fuzzy art or philosophy, so we overcorrected in terms of being even super scientific. So I think that bottom line, what I'm saying is that there are studies that were intended, expected, and funded to be big scale studies. Do them the best you can, and they will contribute some knowledge. Rather than trying to ride both horses, if you can't, do the one study well. But increasingly be activists for the kind of studies that do help us understand, not just as the next presenter is going to talk about, not just the outcomes, but the whys of the outcomes. And that's where these other kinds of studies are really important.
So you talked a bit about exploring students' experiences and recognizing that students don't come as a blank slate. They come with a set of experiences and knowledge when they come to things that we may design. Mm-hmm. I'm curious about your thoughts about the perspectives that an evaluator may bring as they approach a study and being aware of their experiences and perspectives on a topic, for example, like broadening participation.
So the perspective that an evaluator would bring to understanding the students?
So evaluators come with experiences as well, right? And perspectives and ideas that may influence how they perform their work. What are your thoughts on that notion and being more aware, I guess, of maybe biases that we may have on different topics?
Yes. That's a book-length response, but let me start by saying that it is an area of great interest of mine, and I have 3 different little papers that I've been working on. And in fact, at CREA, the annual meeting of CREA, we have a running set of events just focused on this with evaluators of color asking themselves the question in public. I was from a community of color. I went off to the university, got a PhD, and am now an evaluator, and I go back to my community of color, my origin, my community of origin, and I see and feel the tension between what my disciplinary training suggests that I should do and what my native intelligence tells me I should do. It's a graphic illustration of how our biases are not just the result of our origin, it's also our discipline bias. The calculus instructors have all been steeped in, this is how you teach calculus. And letting go of that, or letting go of the idea that calculus has to be conquered before engineering. So those biases creep up from all kinds of places. The point being, yes, the evaluator is the first instrument of the evaluation, and they need to understand as an instrument how they're tuned and what their predispositions are. And so they can then protect their work to the extent that they can from those biases, but also capitalize on the richness that they can bring because of those experiences, because it goes both ways. When I go to an HBCU and interview senior leaders, the reception I get, I can tell because of how quickly the microphone and the recorder seem to not be important. So that rapport that you can establish is a plus, and you should use it when and where you can. But the bottom line is you are the first instrument, and your work lives through you. So you need to be aware of what your predispositions are and so forth. And one last thing, when I teach my evaluation course, I have a little video clip of a show that used to come on television. I'm blanking now on his name, but it was this person who was like born to be a defense attorney, and he drove the prosecutors crazy because he would just wreck them in court. He was extremely successful until something happened and he got somebody off for spousal abuse, and the guy turned around and murdered his wife. So he had this sort of day of reckoning with himself. And the mayor came and recruited him to be a prosecutor to help them put their cases together in a way that would not be so vulnerable to people like him. And it's a good illustration of having a predisposition that makes you really good at something, and so you naturally go and do it. But if you turn it on its head, it can make you good at something else. So I think that's part of the evaluator responsibility, to work reflectively, self-reflectively and reflexively, so that you understand what is working through you into your work.
Thank you. So we're now scheduled for coffee break, but I think we have time maybe for one more question, and I've got someone reaching for the mic.
So there was a pictorial representation of what you were thinking about. If we can go back to that, the one that you're still kind of working out.
Yes.
And so you had basically 4 different quadrants there, and they had self, they had choices and interests in the middle. And so there's 2 schools of thought. One that deals with social identity theory, the other one that deals with basically identity theory.
Right.
I don't necessarily agree with any one of them. I actually think there's a mix, which I call broader impacts identity.
Yes.
But how do you relate social identity theory, or a mixture of those within the context of this schematic?
I teach a course called Developmental Perspectives on Human Diversity, and I use a game to illustrate this point. The game I use is, you'll have to help me think of the name of it, Trivial Pursuit. If you know Trivial Pursuit, this will be useful. If you don't. In the game of Trivial Pursuit, you move around the board, and your game piece is a little receptacle that takes pie-shaped pieces, and it's color-coded. So as you answer questions and you earn a piece to put into your thing, the one who fills it up first wins. Well, if you think of our identities as being very similar, you have a gender identity, you have an ethnic identity, you have a racial identity, you have identity components related to age and so forth. So all of these identity components make up the person, and you carry it with you wherever you go. But like the old IBM Selectric typewriter, and this is really a test, there's a ball with all the letters on it, and you hit the key, the ball turns around and strikes the page with the right letter. Your identity works the same way. You walk into a room and you will sense that your age is what people are noticing, or your gender is what people are noticing. And part of that is because of how they react to you, but also is your sense of vulnerability. That's also where microaggressions come from. Microaggressions are a part of your identity that has been stigmatized that you believe is now being exploited in a comment that someone is making. When Ashanti's advisor said, or instructor said, "Did you write the paper?" For another student with a different background, they would have just said, "No, yeah, I wrote the paper." It wouldn't carry the same sting as if, but if you're from a group that has been told you don't write well, but here you've managed to write a good paper, or if you've been told you're articulate and you're not supposed to be, it's a microaggression because the part of your identity that has been stereotyped is out front and it's impacted. So my response to your point is that as you go through this, different parts of your identity are out front and exposed. And that's what dictates how you're going to perceive and respond to the situation, whether you're going to embrace it or run away from it or freeze.